Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, after I did the video with Simon Whistler from his Top 10s channel, which I think is one of his older channels, I really didn't know much about him, but you guys have been educating me. One of the things I love about this community is how you guys, our collective group thought, is able to just share a wealth of information. And so I have now subscribed to their Biographics channel. And a number of you suggested I should check that one out. So I thought I'd dive into a topic that has been of recent interest to me because I just went to New Mexico a couple of months ago, shot a video that will be going up on the channel in the next few weeks. Just walking around Lincoln, New Mexico, talking a little bit about the events of the Lincoln County War. It's a subject I've been interested in ever since I first saw the movie Young Guns and then the sequel Young Guns 2. Which are somewhat fictionalized version of the story of the Lincoln County War and the aftermath, but has a lot of elements of truth to it. So I thought we would dive into Billy the Kid, Old West hero or cold-blooded killer. Let's check it out together. And one last thing before we get started. Just want to let you know there is going to be an announcement coming up soon here on the channel about some updates, some new things, including a new Discord server that should be going live hopefully sometime next week while I'm in Amsterdam and in the Netherlands. And I also will be updating the kind of interface that you see here on the screen. The current one's a little blurry because I made some changes to it and forgot to save it properly. So I'm going to fix all that up. And like I said, more information to come. Let's go ahead and dive into this.
Made possible by Brilliant. You'll learn more about Brilliant later in today's video, but if you would like to learn more about them right now, go to brilliant.org/biographics. You'll also find a link in the description below. He was America's first and most celebrated Western anti-hero. It was claimed that he killed 21 men, one for every year of his young life, and the press portrayed him as a ruthless, psychotic, wild-eyed killer. The reality was that Billy the Kid was none of these things. And in this week's Biographics, we go in search of the real Billy.
So, you know, like any historical figure, it's no different than how the media sensationalizes things today. The media did that then. It sold more newspapers and it sold more, you know, they had the little books that were like, you know, just kind of like the comic books of the day that told stories. And so everything got sensationalized. And usually in between the extremes is where the truth lies. And that's what we're going to get into, I'm sure.
There is uncertainty as to the birthplace of the child who would become Billy the Kid. Most historians believe it was the slums of New York City and the year was 1859. His birth name was Henry McCarty, and he was the son of Irish immigrants who had come to America to escape the devastating effects of the Irish potato famine.
So, with everything in Billy's early life, and Billy wasn't even his name, as he mentioned, all of it is like, we're pretty sure. We are pretty sure he was born in 1859. It might have been 1860. It might have been 1861. All of these things are based on the preponderance of evidence, the most likely scenario. He was most likely born Henry McCarty. His mother was married multiple times. And his father died at the end of the American Civil War. At least the guy we're pretty sure was his father. It's all speculation.
His mother's name was Catherine, but we know nothing about his father except that he died when Henry was an infant.
So let's talk about his father for a second, because there is a candidate that is most likely the man who was his father. Let me pull that up. So in the Nashville National Cemetery down in Tennessee, these are graves of Civil War soldiers, is a grave for a civilian. And his name was Patrick Henry McCarty. And you can see here he's not listed as being in a regiment. He's listed as an employee because he, and I don't know the details of this, but I know that he was working in that area. Might have been working in a hospital, working for the War Department in a civilian capacity. And he dies on May 25th, 1865, right at the end of the American Civil War. And he gets buried in the cemetery despite the fact that he's not actually a Civil War soldier. And so he's got this civilian stone there. Patrick McCarty, probably the guy who is Billy the Kid's father, but we just don't really know that for sure.
When Henry was around 6, he and his mother joined the post-Civil War exodus to the West in search of the better life that had so far eluded them in the New World. They joined a wagon train and undertook the arduous journey over the Oregon Trail. They got as far as Indianapolis, Indiana. There, Carolyn met and married a man by the name of William Harrison.
He made a little mistake there. It's Catherine, not Karen. Common thing, I've done it a million times where I say, I'm narrating and I forget what I'm saying, so I'll give him a pass on that.
Antrim. Antrim had dreams of striking it rich in the gold mines to the southwest, and soon the makeshift family had relocated to Silver City, New Mexico. New Mexico in the early 1870s was like a foreign country to immigrants from the east. It was mainly peopled by Mexicans and Native Americans. The entire culture and religion was very different to what most Americans were used to. French, Spanish.
Most Americans, yes, but remember that Billy the Kid's mother is from Ireland. Most likely was probably brought up Catholic, so that wouldn't have been all that different in terms of religion to Mexicans, because most Mexicans were Catholic.
Spanish and Navajo were more likely to be spoken than English, and most houses were mesas carved into the sides of rock formations. In this hodgepodge of cultures, violence was commonplace. While many newcomers from the East would have recoiled at such an environment, young Henry McCarty, he embraced it. He immersed himself in the Mexican culture, spending most of his time in the Hispanic part of town. By the time he was a teenager, he could speak fluent Spanish.
And this is going to be huge for him, and this is one of the reasons why he was able to survive as long as he did on the run in Lincoln County, New Mexico, is because of his familiarity with the Spanish culture, the Mexican culture. This is the time, this is, years after Mexico has gotten their independence. And so they speak Spanish, but it's Mexican and Mexican culture. And so he's very familiar with them. He's very popular with the people of Mexican descent in New Mexico.
Could even pass for a native Mexican with his sombrero and poncho. Whenever there was a public Mexican social event, Henry would be there, often with his mother. The two would dance the fandango together and talk easily with the Mexican elders. Unlike most of the Europeans in town, Henry showed respect to the locals, exhibiting a formal politeness to the older generation, which won him a lot of praise. He was remembered by the Hispanic community as a charming boy who was always happy.
So interesting, by the way, this picture that you see here is believed to be only the second photo of Billy the Kid. There's the one photo they showed at the beginning with him holding the rifle is the one that we know for sure is Billy the Kid. It's the only one we know for sure, and it was confirmed by people who knew Billy, who saw the photo and said, yes, that's him. I think it was actually a member of the Maxwell family, which is P. Maxwell's house is where Billy the Kid was killed. So people who knew Billy saw that photo and said, yeah, that's him. The other ones that come up every so often, it's kind of comparing that one to the original. And this one here is one that they believe is Billy and some of his regulators, but there's still people who doubt that.
The humor was cruelly snatched from Henry's life when, at the age of 15, he suffered the loss of his mother. Catherine had been suffering from tuberculosis for some time, and it was hoped that the dry air of New Mexico would improve her condition.
And the idea that the dry air of New Mexico would help with tuberculosis is the same reason that a guy like Doc Holliday, who we know from Tombstone, Arizona, and the Earps and all that sort of thing, he went west for the same reason, because he was dying of tuberculosis.
But it wasn't to be. Catherine died in 1874, leaving Henry in the possession of his stepfather, William Antrim. Antrim, however, had no intention of being tied down with a teenage boy to look after. He promptly abandoned Henry, leaving town in search of more fertile gold diggings. So at the age of 15, Henry was left on his own to fend for himself in a dangerous frontier town. Henry now had to live off his wits. He spent his time hanging around the saloons and prostitutes on the seedier side of town, sleeping in back alleys and boarding houses, and running errands to pay his way. He soon became involved in minor criminal activity, meeting up with a hoodlum by the name of Sombrero Jack. Henry was recruited as a lookout while Jack robbed local businesses. One of them was the local Chinese laundry. Things fell apart when a loaded revolver that Jack had stolen from the laundry was found in Henry's possession. The boy was arrested and thrown into the local jail. It was while sitting in that tiny jail cell that Henry made a fateful decision. He could have sat and waited for the circuit judge to come to town and try his case, but that may have taken months. Instead, he decided to escape. In doing so, he honed a skill that would serve him to good effect many times over the next 5 years. That was getting people to underestimate his abilities. Henry talked his guard into allowing him to come out of his cell for a short period in order to stretch his legs. He was still confined to the jailhouse, and the door to the outside world was securely locked. But there was also a chimney. When his guard was out of the room, Henry managed to squeeze his slight frame up the soot-covered escape hole and onto the roof and then into the town plaza.
And this is another thing about Billy that, in addition to his wits, in addition to his charm, his personality, the build of his body actually helped him a lot in these situations. He was able to escape up a chimney when other people maybe couldn't. He was a small guy. He had wide hands, but narrow wrists, or narrow hands but wide wrists, and that allowed for him to be able to slip his hands out of handcuffs sometimes.
By the time it was discovered that he had escaped, he was free of Silver City and en route to Arizona. Carrying no food supplies and without a horse, Henry displayed an incredible physical and mental strength in crossing the desert plains of the Southwest. He quickly learned that he had to live off the land, foraging where he could and stealing where he must. The 16-year-old wanted fugitive made it across 500 miles of deserts before stumbling into a remote army outpost in eastern Arizona called Camp Grant. Here, he managed to find employment as a cook on a local ranch. After hours, he drifted to the local town where he took to gambling and hustling in the saloons.
Now, it's important to note, as you're hearing this story, that none of this so far gives the indication of a guy who is a ruthless killer, which is the way Billy's sometimes described. A lot of the early parts of his life these are things that are going to come out of the circumstances of his life. It's going to come out of desperation and necessity. Now, I'm not justifying committing crimes just because you're in a difficult situation, but when you're on your own in the middle of a relatively lawless region, sometimes it's easy to go down that path. And a lot of things are going to happen that weren't necessarily of his making, circumstances that happen around him that forge him into the person that he'll become. That is not to say that we can justify some of the decisions that he will make later in his life. The guy committed crimes. He was a murderer. There's no doubt about that. But he probably wasn't necessarily predisposed to go that direction.
The men he was now associated with included some hardened criminals, and they quickly showed him the ropes. Before long, he was participating in stealing horses. Outside of his ranch duties and his nefarious nighttime activities, young Henry found the time to perfect his skills with a firearm. He had managed to buy a revolver and quickly discovered an innate ability to wield it. With this skill came instant respect from those around him. Within a year of escaping the jail cell in Silver City, Henry had developed into a character of note among thugs in the Arizona Territory. He wore a brightly colored scarf around his neck and walked with the self-assuredness of a man many years older than his only 17 years. And it was at this time that people began to call him the Kid. It was August the 17th, 1877, when the Kid went from small-time crook to hardened killer. The local blacksmith was a bully by the name of Frank Cahill. On that night, while drinking in a saloon, Cahill had his sights set on Henry, and he was throwing insults at the Kid. When the Kid called him a son of a bitch, Cahill jumped him and proceeded to pound him on the saloon floor. Pinned underneath the bigger man, the Kid managed to free his six-shooter. He shot Cahill in the stomach and then quickly slid out from under him. Leaving the blacksmith to die, he hightailed it out of town on a stolen horse and headed back to New Mexico.
Now, up until this point, a lot of what we know about Billy the Kid, as we call him, is speculation. But that one is something everyone agrees on. This is well established that the first guy he kills is Frank Cahill, and it's really in self-defense. Now, you can argue, well, he kind of brought it on himself by the things he was saying and by the fact he didn't take no crap from this guy. But that was a survival instinct in this world. You had to stand up for yourself. And he was standing up for himself. He's 17 years old now. He's growing. He's confident. He's got a gun on him. He's not going to take crap from this guy. When the guy starts pounding him, he does what he has to do. And this now leads to him fleeing back to New Mexico, and now we're getting really close to the Lincoln County War, which is going to happen within a year.
Now a wanted fugitive for the crime of murder, the kid changed his name to William H. Bonney. He wandered across the vast open spaces, relying on the hospitality of Hispanic ranchers to...
So you see there, it's interesting, we've got a description of the guy. Wanted, Billy the Kid, age 18, 5'3", weight 125 pounds. So you get kind of a sense of the size of him. He's not a big guy. Now, he may have gotten taller when he got a little older, because sometimes that happened. Not everybody's like me, who's the same height he was when he was 14 years old. But, Ulysses S. Grant's a great example. Ulysses S. Grant was pretty short, pretty small when he started at West Point, but as an adult, he actually got taller. I think he went from like 5'1" to 5'7" while he was at West Point, something like that.
Wandered across the vast open spaces, relying on the hospitality of Hispanic ranchers to provide him with a meal or a place to lay his head. Meanwhile, New Mexico was being targeted by big-shot land speculators from back east. They saw the mostly barren territory as a golden opportunity for speculation, and they began buying up land parcels from Hispanic settlers, usually at prices that were manifestly unfair to the seller. Those who didn't want to sell their lands likely were going to find themselves facing violent persecution. Soon, the Eastern entrepreneurs had wrested control of every industry in the state, from mining to the cattle industry and even the railroads. The largest county in New Mexico was Lincoln, which covered nearly a fifth of the entire territory.
It wasn't just the largest county in New Mexico. At the time it was established, I think in 1869 is when Lincoln County is established. It's the largest county in the United States anywhere. It's huge. And this is part of why Billy the Kid is able to function as he does, because there's so much wide open territory where there's just nothing. And the Lincoln County Sheriff has to cover all of this territory, and he has to hire a lot of deputies to handle it. And sometimes some of the people that he hires are not necessarily kind of reputable people.
It was there, in 1878, that a war broke out that would have a profound effect on the remaining years of Billy the Kid's life. In the late 1860s, a couple of Irish immigrants by the names of Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan had bought up the majority of Lincoln County and turned it into a huge cattle ranch. They had secured extremely large military contracts to supply beef to Fort Stanton. The Murphy-Dolan monopoly in Lincoln County was called the House, and it was...
And it's called the House partly because it was just, it was kind of like, an early version of Irish mobster crime is what it was. But they also had physically a building, which incidentally was not only the Murphy-Dolan store, but was also the courthouse eventually. And they had everybody in their pocket. It's a lot like what you see in the 1940s, for example, or 1920s, 1930s. Think The Godfather, but instead of with Sicilians, you have the Irish. They had the law enforcement in their pocket. They had the military in their pocket because they were supplying the food for the fort. They had the government, the civilian government in their pocket. They had everybody. And it's also because they're Irish. And when an English guy comes along who's going to challenge that, well, you can do the math of what's going to happen.
Fiercely protected by a band of thugs known as the Seven Rivers Gang. They operated from a huge wooden building in the middle of the Lincoln Township and controlled every business in town. In 1877, the House monopoly over Lincoln County was challenged, first in court and then on the range by a Scottish-born local attorney by the name of Alexander McSween. Teaming up with the lawyer was a 23-year-old, recently arrived British aristocrat by the name of John Tunstall.
If you've ever seen the movie Young Guns, you know that Terrence Stamp plays John Tunstall, and he's an older man, and he's kind of this father figure to Billy the Kid and to Charlie Baldry and all these other guys. He's not. He's 23 years old when he arrives. He's only 24 when he dies. He was a young guy, just a few years older than these men. I don't know why they chose to portray it that way.
With a seemingly unending supply of funds, Tunstall was intent on creating his own cattle empire in the county. In this quest, he enjoyed the support of the most successful and famous cattle baron in the entire country, John Chisholm. Tunstall began to recruit employees not only to work the cattle, but also provide the protection that he knew would be needed when he came up against the House. William Bonney rode into Lincoln County in mid-1877 and immediately proceeded to do what he did best, and that was steal horses. In short order, he was caught and thrown in jail. It just so happened that the man he had been rustling horses from, well, that was John Tunstall. When the Englishman confronted the teenage outlaw, he declined to press charges. Instead, he offered the kid a job as a member of the Regulators, the team of cowboys that were his protection squad.
And, it's important to give credit to Tunstall here that he saw something in the kid and wanted to give him a chance to get his life on the right track. He didn't immediately press charges for this guy stealing from him. He saw an opportunity. And it's fair to say, too, that Tunstall needed all the help he could get for protection because the Murphy-Dolan ring had so many people on their side. It was difficult to get people, and so giving him a second chance and also benefiting yourself in the process.
Billy, he grabbed this offer with both hands. In John Tunstall, he had found a man who would give him a fair break. He later said this of his employer: "Tunstall was the only man who treated me like I was decent and white." The kid joined a group of men, all older than him, as he learned the work of a cowboy. It was long, arduous, often back-breaking work, and they slept out with the cattle on the range. For the leaders of the house, Murphy and Dolan, the idea of an upper-crust Englishman moving in on their territory was unthinkable. Like the kid's parents, they had escaped the famine back in Ireland and deeply resented the English over their unwillingness to provide relief. Now having found...
Which is fair, as we talked about when we covered the Irish potato famine. There's a fair amount of earned resentment among the Irish for the way that the British government handled that and made it worse.
A new life in the New World, were they again to be plagued by the power and the money of the English? Well, that's something they would never allow to happen. Murphy and Dolan's power extended to control of the legal system that Lincoln County operated under. They enlisted the aid of William Brady, the corrupt sheriff, to enforce a fake court order that confiscated all of the horses and cattle on the Tunstall Ranch.
Now, this is interesting because this is traditionally how William Brady is described in the history. He's the corrupt sheriff that was in the pocket of the Murphy-Dolan ring. Some of you may have seen my video where I was in New Mexico a month or so ago. A little more than that, I guess now. I met William Brady's great-great-grandson. I was doing an event at the school, and one of the volunteers came over, and we were talking, and I found out that he was William Brady's great-great-grandson. And I recorded a little bit of my conversation with him and then my thoughts about it afterwards, and I'll throw the link up at the end if you want to see that, if you haven't already. Help me see a different side of William Brady. I don't think that he's quite as black and white the bad guy as a lot of people kind of sell him to be. I can see a scenario in which William Brady thought he was doing the right thing, thought he was enforcing the law, and was cold-blooded murdered by Billy the Kid. Like a lot of things in history, it's complicated, and it's probably somewhere in between, but I do not think that William Brady was the evil, bad guy, corrupt sheriff in the pocket of the Murphy-Dolans that he's sold to be.
When Tunstall received the demand, he thought it was some kind of mistake and proceeded to ride into town in order to sort things out. On the way there, he was met by the sheriff and a posse of men on their way to execute the court order. Still thinking he could reason with the lawman, Tunstall rode towards the sheriff. But before he got close, members of the posse, they shot him dead. To add insult to injury, they then shot his horse.
Now, when this happened, Billy the Kid and some of the other regulators were in the vicinity, but none of them actually saw what happened. They heard the gunshots. They found him dead afterwards. But Brady and the others will say that when they attempted to execute the warrant, Tunstall fought back, and they had no choice but to kill him. It's possible that's what happened. We have no idea. It's also possible that they murdered him. We don't know for sure, but there's no way you can say with 100% certainty who was at fault and who was to blame and what the situation was. But obviously, the Murphy-Dolan side saw this as a justified killing of a man who was resisting arrest, and the regulators saw this as the cold-blooded murder of their benefactor, the man they worked for, and they were going to get revenge.
Tunstall's body was soon found by the men who worked for him and taken back to his ranch for burial. Billy was incensed at the cold-blooded assassination of his boss, and he, along with a group of hardcore other employees, made a pact of vengeance.
Now, I will say this about, they said he was taken back to the ranch for burial. That's not where he's buried today. Now, I can't say for sure he wasn't initially buried on his ranch. His ranch was dozens of miles outside of Lincoln, the town. But today, Tunstall and McSween are both buried right behind their store. In fact, that's one of the places I visited that you'll see in the video when I put it up, where you can see their graves there to this day.
Against the house. They made a hit list, at the top of which was the Sheriff of Lincoln County, William Brady. Brady's end came on April Fool's Day 1878, as he was taking his morning stroll through Lincoln. Billy and his fellow regulators were lying in ambush and poured more than a dozen bullets into his body.
Again, kind of true, kind of a little more complicated than that. Billy and the other regulators are at Tunstall McSween's store on the streets of Lincoln. And they didn't come there planning to ambush Sheriff Brady. They happened to see Brady walking down the middle of the street and decided to ambush him, decided to attack him then. And so they came outside the store, they went around to this adobe wall, and they ended up ambushing him. And Billy was actually shot in the process. And we don't know for sure who killed Brady. Brady was shot several times, but Billy gets the credit for that, but he was one of several people who were shooting.
During the gunfight that ensued with Brady's deputies, Billy was shot in the thigh. 3 days later,
and actually also George Hinman, or Hinman, I think it's pronounced there, was also killed during that process. So it was the sheriff and his deputy.
Occurred at Blazer's Mill. This time, 2 of the regulators were killed. As a result of the 2 incidents, several murder warrants were issued, including one for Billy. The conflict came to a head when Alexander McSween rode from the Tunstall Ranch with between 50 and 60 regulators on July the 14th, 1868. Some of the men strategically positioned themselves between buildings and on rooftops, while others, including Billy, set themselves up in a house that belonged to McSween. For the next 2 days, they waited. On July the 16th, the new sheriff, George Pepin, sent some men to kill the regulators who were stationed on the roof of the saloon. After one of their number was killed, these men were forced to retreat. Pepin now sent a message to Fort Stanton requesting military assistance. The request was initially turned down, but the military brass changed their mind the next day. With that, Colonel Nathan Dudley rode into town at the head of a troop of soldiers. A standoff ensued for a couple more days. Then, on Friday, July the 19th, all hell broke loose. The regulators were now all holed up in the McSween house.
And this is the scene that you see a fictionalized version of at the end of the first Young Guns movie, is this Battle of Lincoln that takes place. You see the army come in, they've got Gatling guns and the whole bit, and this is where you're going to see, I think, Charlie Bowdry get killed and Alexander McSween get killed, and Billy is able to escape out of there.
A massive barrage of firepower was unleashed on this house, with return fire coming just as fiercely. Then the house was set on fire. In an attempt to escape, Alexander McSween was shot dead. Billy managed to kill the man who had felled McSween before making good on his own escape along with the other regulators. Now, just before we get into the rest of Billy's life, I do want to take a moment to thank the people who make this video possible, and that would be brilliant.
Just before we allow him to do his thing about his sponsor, I do want to mention the Posse Comitatus Act, which you hear mentioned a lot in modern times. I think they even cover that in recent movies and even in the series The West Wing. Posse Comitatus is the act that the use of the United States military is illegal to enforce domestic policy within the United States. And it was actually passed just weeks before the Lincoln County War. And so technically speaking, the use of the military to deal with the Lincoln County War, this situation in the Battle of Lincoln against Billy the Kid and the regulators, was illegal. It was a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. But the chances that anyone knew or even cared that that bill had been passed at the time of the Battle of Lincoln is probably slim to none.
I know a mid-roll ad is not great for the story here, but these videos are long, so I do hope you appreciate our need to have sponsors to make them possible. Brilliant are a learning platform which teaches through something called active learning. Unlike Biographics,
Never heard of this one.
just a nice way to learn about people's lives, learning about science is a bit trickier. I don't know if you've ever had to sit down with a science textbook. I have, and I read them, and there's a whole lot of stuff that makes me think, what, hold on a second, and then you end up reading the page 6 times over and you're still not taking it in. Well, Brilliant solves that problem with active learning. Brilliant give you something super short to read, it's really easy, and then you immediately apply it to a problem. You rinse and repeat that, and suddenly you're understanding all sorts of stuff that you really didn't think you'd be able to. I've been using Brilliant, and you should just go try it just to see how easy it is to suddenly be understanding all these complex subjects. It's really Brilliant, just make them super easy to grasp.
It's
you
brilliant.
can support Biographics by going to brilliant.org/biographics. And now, let's get back to the kid. By now, Billy had developed into a seasoned killer. He was now wanted for multiple counts of murder in different jurisdictions. Still, he was able to find refuge with the Hispanic sheepherders who viewed him as a fighter for their liberty against the Anglo robber barons. The firestorm that had erupted in the heart of Lincoln County forced authorities to act. Indictments were issued for the arrest of Billy and 2 other regulators for the murder of Sheriff Brady.
Yeah, and President Rutherford B. Hayes calls the Lincoln's only just the main street, and then the buildings on that street. You'll see in the video. He called it the most deadly street and the most dangerous street in America. And they replaced the governor. Governor Axtell gets replaced by Lew Wallace. So a lot of changes happen.
A new governor of New Mexico Territory was also appointed.
Take a shot.
The man given the job was Lew Wallace, a former Union Army general and future author of the book Ben-Hur.
Yep.
Wallace set out for Lincoln County with direct instructions from President Rutherford B. Hayes to restore order. But Wallace encountered a population who were too terrified to get involved and so was unable to secure any witness testimonies as to what had been occurring. Then he received a letter from a man calling himself William H. Bonney. The kid offered to testify against the members of the House in return for full amnesty, and Wallace agreed.
So here is one of those moments where Billy, Henry McCarty's his name, or Henry Antrim. Sometimes he was called Kid Antrim. A lot of different names. He's going by Billy at this point. Where he's trying to do the right thing. He wants to bring these guys down legitimately, the Murphy Dolan people. He wants to testify. He wants to get amnesty in return. This could have been a moment that was a turning point in a positive direction for his life, where he didn't have to go down the outlaw trail, but circumstances didn't allow that to happen.
Billy testified before a grand jury, with his testimony leading to indictments against a number of House members, including leader James Dolan. Billy had lived up to his side of the deal, but unfortunately the governor did not live up to his, skipping town before the amnesty could be formalized.
Here comes Pat Garrett.
With the governor gone, most of the indictments against the House members, they were dropped, but those against the regulators, they remained. Billy fled town before he could be arrested. While the other regulars fled New Mexico Territory, Billy decided to stay put and eke out a living as a cattle and horse rustler. Over the next few months, he harassed the ranchers of the House Empire, in the process becoming the most wanted man in New Mexico. The newspapers of New Mexico, most of which were simply mouthpieces for the House, demonized the kid, blaming him for every misdeed in the territory.
So think about it. If the people he's stealing from are the most wealthy, influential people in the territory, obviously there's going to be a lot of money and a lot of power behind bringing him down, because they're the people being directly impacted by this. And since they're already influential enough to have influence over the state, military, local authorities, it's only a matter of time before you get everybody after you.
In 1880, the editor of the Las Vegas Gazette first named the outlaw Billy the Kid, the name for which he would forever be known.
Here's Pat.
By the summer of 1880, though he still roamed the territory, Billy had made a base for himself at Fort Sumner, some 100 miles from Lincoln. By now, Lincoln had a new sheriff, and his name was Pat Garrett, and he was single-minded with his obsession to capture Billy the Kid. Garrett was a tenacious, determined man. He and his posse tracked Billy and his gang over the winter of 1880. 2 of the outlaws were killed in a shootout, with the others being cornered in a cabin at a place called Stinking Springs. After a tense standoff, Billy finally came out with his hands in the air. The kid was transported by train to Santa Fe and put on trial for the murder of Sheriff Brady. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The next and supposedly last stop was Lincoln, where he was held in a second-story room of the Lincoln County Courthouse. It was there that he was to wait for his date with the noose. But, well, Billy, he had other plans.
So the Lincoln County Courthouse is upstairs of the Murphy Dolan story. It's the house. It's the building that they operated out of. That's where Billy's held. It doesn't really have a jail in it, so they make a jail up there. And where Billy's held is he's held separate from the other prisoners. He's held in a room that basically just has like a bed and I think a chair. And he's shackled to the floor and he's guarded. And I don't want to get too far ahead in the story. I'll see what he covers first before I fill it in.
On April the 28th, 1881, in the early afternoon, Billy told his guard that he needed to use the privy. The guard escorted him in shackles to the outhouse.
So while this is happening, there are two deputies, Bob Ollinger and Deputy Bell. Bob Ollinger is a stone-cold killer. He had done some pretty shady things himself, and he had no trouble pulling the trigger on a guy if necessary. Bell's a little less like that, and Billy and Bell actually got along really well. Ollinger, on the other hand, was not somebody that Billy thought too highly of. And Ollinger had taken the other prisoners kind of like 2 doors down and across the street to a hotel and restaurant to get them fed. Well, Billy was kept, and Bell was watching Billy, and that's when this all unfolds.
On the way back, as he went up the stairs to his room, Billy managed to slip out of his hand shackles. He turned and wrestled with the guard, managing to grab his gun. The man turned...
Now, there are a couple of different stories about how this went down. Pat Garrett was convinced that when you go up the stairs, and Billy was walking ahead of Bell, to the right would be where Billy's shackled and being kept. To the left was the armory, and there were shotguns there. And Pat Garrett believed that what happened was Billy got ahead of Bell, ran over and got one of the shotguns and got the drop on Bell that way. Others speculated that he slipped out of his shackles first. There was one speculation that he slipped out and used one of the shackles to hit Bell, whack him in the face, and then took Bell's gun. There's a lot of different stories about how it went down.
Turned to flee, but Billy shot him dead. The kid then made for one of the rooms in which he knew there was a shotgun. Quick!
And I should add to this that according to Billy, that's what happened, is that he slipped out of it, he hit Bell with the shackle, took his gun. I think that's what Billy said happened. And didn't want to shoot Bell. He pulled the gun on Bell, told Bell to stay quiet and not move, but Bell tried to run, and that's when he shot him. And Bell actually survived for a brief amount of time.
Quickly loading it, he ran to a window and looked down on the street to see another guard, Bob Olinger, who had been eating his lunch across the way, come running to investigate. Billy called out, "Hello, Bob," before blasting him with both barrels. Yep. With both guards dead, Billy then raced downstairs. He commandeered a horse and was away.
It's a little more complicated than that. Billy actually stayed in town for a little while. He was up on the deck on the second floor, and he actually talked to the crowd who accumulated and basically told them, listen, don't try to stop me, don't do anything, I don't want to hurt anybody else, and kind of announced his intentions to the crowd, and I think was there for a little while before finally escaping.
Billy's daring escape made him the most famous outlaw in the country, but it also made him a 3-time cop killer. This changed Pat Garrett's mind. Now he wanted to hunt him down and kill him. Despite this, Billy chose to remain in New Mexico. The reason being is that he had fallen in love with a 16-year-old girl by the name of Paulita Maxwell. And
it was Paulita Maxwell who would later identify Billy as the one in the well-known photo of Billy.
Back in Lincoln, Garrett was receiving information as to the whereabouts of the kid. They were being supplied by the older brother of Paulita, Pete Maxwell, who was not happy about this romance. He told Garrett that Billy was in Fort Sumner. Garrett finally moved on the intelligence. He stole into Fort Sumner on the evening of July the 14th, 1881, with 2 deputies alongside him. They went straight to the home of the Maxwells. Posting the 2 deputies on the front porch, he entered the house from the back and made for the bedroom of Pete Maxwell. At this very moment, Billy was approaching the porch. In the dark, he could only just make out the shape of the 2 men there, and he called out, "Who is it?" But there was no reply.
He said it in Spanish. He said, "Quién es? Quién es?"
At this, Billy cautiously backed through the open doorway. Inside, Garrett and Maxwell were sitting on the bed. On seeing the figure, Maxwell leaned over and whispered, "It's him." Garrett leveled his six-shooter and fired. Billy the Kid fell dead, never knowing who had fired the fatal bullet. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did.
Yeah, and there's, of course, the speculation Billy survived, but at least according to all the people who knew Billy, he was dead. But we'll never know for sure. That's one of those what-ifs that people like to debate about. But add your own to this story. Use the comment section below and let me know what else you think about it all. Check out my conversation with the great-great-grandson of Sheriff William Brady. I'll put the link up, and just me sharing my thoughts about that conversation and how it affected my view of the history. And be watching for my video from Lincoln in the coming weeks. Thanks a lot.